Well, welcome to Jumpstart number 10. And we'll call this like a prelude to wet under wet painting. So what is wet under wet painting? Well, basically it's pretty simple. You're applying a wet brush to a totally wet piece of paper, and you basically paint that painting almost in its entirety while the paper is still wet. The whole paper. Now, it's not a natural way to paint. A natural way to paint would be something you'd like doing crayon or oil pastel or oil paint. You know, where you paint the sky first, and then you go ahead and do the cloud, then you do the mountain, and then you do your center of interest, and you bring each one of those pieces to fruition piece by piece. But watercolor doesn't work that way. Watercolor, you're painting the whole painting, everything, sky, mountains, center of interest, and you're painting them all at the same time. And as the paper dries, you're almost finished with the painting. Then the paper's dry, and then you finish it up with a few strokes. Theoretically, you make your corrections just like you would do in a piece-by-piece painting. That's quite different. It's not natural. It's exciting. It's fun. I love it. And I hope to convey a little bit of that to you. So if you've been following along, most of the abstract painting that I've been doing so far has been wet under wet. You've seen it already. But now we're going to nail it down, and I'm going to do a couple of exercises that I recommend that you do. If you have the patience and you just want to jump right into wet painting, then do these exercises first. They don't will take long, and they're going to be worth your while. So here's the step-by-step in a wet painting. It's all about fluid dynamics. Step one, you have a wet paper, you have a wet brush. Usually the brush is a little wetter than the paper, and the paint, and when you apply the brush to the paper, the water and pigment flows out, and it flows onto a bed of, it's like a lake bed almost. It just flows out, and it's really exciting and really fun, and you see all sorts of great wet effects. And it's unpredictable. It's out of control, but it's fun to do. Negative, beside being out of control, is whatever you do in step one is going to dry so much lighter because all this water on the paper is dispersing. It's diluting the pigment, and so you're going to get a pretty dry application, or a pretty light application of paint. Okay. Now, as the paper starts to dry a little bit, or actually not, let's just say that stays equally wet, you can gain control by mixing up paint and then drying your brush so the brush is drier than the paper. Now, when the brush is drier than the paper and you stroke your pigment on, the pigment transfers by friction, and the water transfers from the paper into the brush. And that means you don't get this flow. You have control. So step two, you build up soft shapes in more control. Then we get into step three, which is you start applying another layer of paint, and you start working for those middle values. And the way to get something to stay middle value, that's halfway between light and dark, it looks pretty dark, is to overlap areas that already have paint. Or just plan on a couple of overlapping layers. Mix your paint up, dry your brush, paint. That's step three. And then the final part of step three would be to get some dark darks. So already we have several layers of paint over some areas of the paper. Well, now you just mix up more dark, intense pigment. And I use ultramarine blue and burnt sienna and the dark reds, along with cadmium reds and quinacridone reds. And you can paint right over some of those middle values, and then we're going to get something that's going to stay pretty dark. Not black yet. You're going to have to go over a fourth or fifth time to get some really dark darks that and wet into wet where they stay dark. So just repeat the process, as you'll see in the demonstration, how many times I go over certain areas of the paint before it really stays dark, and even so it lightens up sometimes. So you might ask, why bother? I can get a dark by just letting the paper dry and then over painting a dark pigment right over that, and do it a couple of times, and I'll have a block on my painting, and piece by piece painting. And that's true, you can. And there's some wonderful piece by piece painters. Most watercolor painters are piece by piece painters. And they've figured out how to do that, usually using staining colors, which I don't. But you'll find that in this process, the wet into wet process, there's a certain glow, a very subtle glow and moist look that happens in the dark areas that are not reproducible piece by piece. You do not get muddy darks wet into wet. You can, okay, I fess up. Yeah, you can, but you have a greater chance of getting lively, beautiful darks wet into wet than if you do it piece by piece and just overlap. So, join me in the demonstration. I hope you pick up. I'm going to start off by filling in my palette with fresh, moist paint where I need it. My blues look good. You need to be generous and wet into wet with your watercolor paint. The moisture on the paper will dissipate the paint, and you generally need a lot of it to get intense coloration. Step one in these exercises is to moisten the paper. This panel, we're just going to look at the beginning steps. We've got a very moist paper. And now I'm going to mix up some really wet paint. And this is a very fun step. So lots of water. As long as you keep the bottom wet, you're probably not going to have any, or the bottom dry, you're not going to have any negative bleed back effects. It looks pretty intense. It looks pretty dark at this point. But even these oozle-like effects are rather attractive at this point, but that one might end up being unattractive, so I'm going to just play around with it. So, even though we have some intense colors wet, they're going to dry very light. I doubt if anything here will dry much darker than middle light value, just kind of a middle light value. Beautiful watery effects, but the disadvantage is pretty out of control. It's pretty hard to do a landscape painting of any sort with this level of, or lack of level of control. I'm going to just dab up the bottom. We don't have any oozles. So the second effect is I want to demonstrate what happens when you dry your brush. And take a look at the amount of control that enables us to do. So this will be painting a drier brush into a wet piece of paper. This paper is still soaked. This is me from Video Futureland, and while I'm editing the video here in the future, I realized that the camera is not picking up what I do to dry the brush. And this is extremely important since I do it all the time and it's off camera. So let's demonstrate. There are two ways to dry the brush. One, okay, brush, wet brush, assume it's wet. And dry rag, just go ahead and dab the top of the brush right on the rag, and that will dry the brush. Interestingly, it does not change the intensity of the paint that you apply on the paper. So if you have a light wash, it'll still be a light wash. If you have a real dark wash, it'll still be a really dark wash when you paint the paper. Okay, there are times when you need to really significantly dry the brush when you're working on wet paper to avoid those dreaded bleedbacks. More about that coming up. Okay. And this is the best way to do it. I use the rag and I actually squeeze the brush right on the metal part, right there, and drain the water away from the brush. Squeeze. Now I'm ready to paint. Don't squeeze the tip of the brush, just the base of the brush. Okay, now I'm going to send you back to the video past. A dry brush, a drier brush against, and we're going to lay that onto a wet piece of paper. Well, heck, we don't have any drips or anything. We're kind of in borderline control here. Lots of pigment. Okay, again, I'm going to dry my brush. And what we got here is a little bit more control. And yet we still have very soft, wet shapes. Enjoy those shapes. Those shapes are something easy to do in watercolor and difficult to do or time-consuming to do in oils and other media. So you see how much control we have here on a wet piece of paper. Okay, the next demonstration, we're going to kind of redo what we just did, but we're also going to generate something that's going to stay middle dark, and even dark while the paper's wet. Now you can always get darks after the paper is dry. You can always just overlap the paint on a dry piece of paper. But I find those darks are very muddy looking and not very attractive. But if you generate darks while the paper is wet and middle values, you get some really lovely dark shapes that have a glowing quality about them. So let's go ahead. I'm going to just start with the same way I started the last one. I'll throw a little yellow in here for the fun of it. Just let it out. Have fun with it. Here I am old timer that I am, I just still love watching that paint do its thing on the paper. It's just gorgeous to watch. And I wish I could just freeze frame it like in a photograph, but it doesn't. It dries lighter, and it never looks as exciting at this stage by just stopping the painting process. It'll just dry up light, and it won't capture the essence of what we've got right now. So again, keeping the paper wet, just getting some more drips. All right, now I want to start thinking in terms of middle values. And I'm going to dry my brush, again, same way I have been doing it. Dry my brush. Even those are going to dry light. So, but now I've got something, a middle value gesture that I kind of like. And let's try a little something else here. I might be able to build a design with that, an abstract design. Now I'm going to switch my brushes up. No, I'm not. I'm going to work with this big brush. Just work with the biggest brush possible. So, how do you get a middle value that stays middle value? That's the real problem in watercolor, wet under wet. And you do that by overlap a very dry brush. Now we're dealing very dry onto a wet piece of paper. Very dry brush. Okay, I'm pulling off some lights by a very dry brush. Call this subtractive painting. Now I'm going to change to a smaller brush. These areas that look so nice and dark now are going to dry, maybe middle value if we're lucky. So we need to overlap a third time. Intense paint, very dry brush. Okay, very dry brush. A little brown in there just to neutralize it. Now we're getting something that's going to stay pretty dark. Still not dark, not black by any means, even though it looks pretty dark right now. And now in order to make this actually be black when it's dry, I need to overlap it again. Now my pigments are not staining dark pigments. I don't like those pigments. They're not very good for making corrections. They stain the paper. But if you like those paints, they will stay dark faster. But these are just the traditional watercolor pigments. This is like ultramarine blue, burnt sienna. They're highly pigmented. I'm going to have to go over them even then. Again. Okay. Ultramarine blue, and this is quinacridone red. Let's see. It's a pretty big area of dark, so let's take a bite out of that, and let's try something a little cobalt turquoise in there and see what that does. Ooh, isn't that fun? Every now and then something works. Now a little turquoise in there without scrubbing it out, that's nice too. Little cerulean blue. Okay, so now we're going to blow dry it, and we're going to see if these areas stay black. Maybe not. Maybe I should have even pushed it further with the overlap. So bear with me while we blow. So, yes, look at this. We do have areas that are actually black, and they're really interesting blacks. This area, for instance, this is getting pretty close in there to black, a little black in there. We have a lot of middle values with some middle darks, so we get some middle darks in here too. We have a lot of lights around, and I think we've succeeded in what I was trying to demonstrate, which was getting those middle and dark values by overlapping several times. I mean, I had to overlap this probably 4 times with intense color. And that's just because wet paper tends to disperse the pigment. It's like you're diluting the pigment right on the paper. But you can work around it. You can just add more pigment, and you get these really glorious wet looks. Now over here, remember how dark that all looked when I put it down? Well, I do. And you can see how light it is now. I mean, compared to that, I mean, this isn't even middle value. Maybe a little middle value there, but boy, it looked like that when we put it down at first. It just dries light. So I want to call your attention to this unsightly mark here. That's called an ousel or a bleed back. And that happens all the time in wet painting, unless you can nip it in the bud sometimes you can't. But generally speaking, this is because I was spattering water over here and it got onto that paper, and that paper wasn't totally dry yet. Generally, if you make your brush drier than the paper, you will not get that effect. So just keep your brush drier than the paper on those last stages. Don't put a sopping wet brush onto a drying piece of paper. It's just going to create that. These marks hardly ever look good in a painting. In fact, I would say If I see something like that, I'll just scrub it out immediately. The only way to save this painting, if I wanted to, would be to scrub that out entirely, like this. And then repaint part of it. Now I could create an easel now too by just scrubbing it like that. So I'm going to use my rag here to dry it out so we don't get that unconformity of wet into dry. So now I just have to repaint that. But you see, it looks so much better now after I got rid of that unsightly mark. It's just very attention-getting. Okay. Well, I encourage you all to go ahead and warm up with something like this. This is sort of just for the fun of it, a demonstration, and at least get the feel for adding water and taking away water and the effects you get. And it is fun. I mean, there's nothing more fun than a wet into wet pre-painting, because you can just let it go. And if you don't like it, you can wipe the whole thing out if you wanted, and then use the paper over again with my pigments. Okay, let's move on. The next Jumpstart's going to be